Boy, so Lassie's adventure sure has begun, trying to get home all the way from Scotland. We are moving on to a chapter called What a Painter Saw. Here's our picture. Looks like there's a boat there. Okay, let's see what happens next to Lassie. The time was turning to the deepness of summer. Leslie Freeth lay back lazily in the bow of the rowboat. He puffed his pipe contentedly and watched the smoke go evenly in the cool morning air, drifting back to where McBain methodically pulled at the oars. "It'd be better if I sat in the back, Mr. McBain," he said. "Nay, she trims better, I've told ye, Mr. Freeth. She's a very particular boat," the oarsman said. Freeth puffed evenly and gave himself up to the day. There was no reasoning with these hard-headed Scots. Yet, if McBain wanted him in the bow, his eyes took in the glory of the Scottish landscape, and Freeth was happy. The lochs, happy hunting ground of the British fishermen, meant something else to Leslie Freeth. They are the places whose beauty, long treasured by the Scotsmen, is also a magnet to English painters, and Leslie Freeth was one of those who never tired of the everlasting change of light and shadow that moved about the wide waters and the purpling hills. Each summer he came again to paint and to resume earthy contact with the McBains, who dourly welcomed him back to their cottage and gave him studio room in their fine stone barn. So, content with the day, he lay back in the bow until the boat grated on the shingle of a small island. Mechanically, he helped McBain unload the paraphernalia, the easel, the canvases, the metal paint boxes. He set up the canvas and the folding chair. He cocked his head to one side and regarded the unfinished painting. "Well, I'll be back for ye at the noon," McBain said. "All right, Mr. McBain, I'll be several hours on this. How do you think it's coming?" Mr. McBain walked heavily to a position of vantage and, shutting one eye, began cocking his head from side to side. Throughout the long winters, at the small inn by the loch, McBain would argue for hours, if need be, that this Mr. Freeth was one of Britain's greatest landscapists, for whom all the Dutch and the French school would have bowed, if only they had been still alive to do so. But in the artist's presence, Mr. McBain never let his undoubtedly prejudiced opinion show for an instant. "Well, since you're asking me, I would say she's a wee bit on the gaudy side. Twater's a bit too violent and losh, but I never saw the ben that colour, and your clouds are very startling, but I don't doubt she's fine elsewheres." Leslie Freeth smiled. He was used to McBain's criticisms. Moreover, he really valued them, for the dour Scotsman had a good eye and a sound appreciation of his fair-faced land. So Freeth nodded, his eyes going from his canvas to the landscape, back and forth. He was thinking how still it all was, not a movement anywhere except the gentle lap of the water that slapped at the bottom of the rowboat down by the shore. Not a movement, except he shaded his eyes. "See that, Mr. McBain? A deer?" The Scotsman glanced at Freeth's outstretched arm, pointing. His own eyes sought the shore of the northern mainland. The heavy, sandy eyebrows lowered as they would shield the gray-blue eyes below them. "A deer?" the artist repeated the question. McBain shook his head without speaking. His eyes, used to the outdoors, were keener than the Englishman's. "Well, I never," he ejaculated finally. "What is it?" "A dog," the old man said. He shaded his eyes with his hand. The artist did the same. "So it is, I can see now." Now that he was satisfied, Freeth made as if to turn to his painting, but the older man still gazed steadily. His attention brought the artist back to steady staring. "A collie," McBain said. "Now, what would it be doing?" "Oh, probably one from somewhere around. A farm dog?" The Scotsman shook his head. Gazing steadily, he saw the animal come to the water's edge and wade in several feet. Then it backed away, ran along the bank several yards, and tried again. It kept repeating this as if some new spot it would find the water had disappeared and dry land was at its feet. "Havers, Mr. Freeth, it looks as if it's seeking to cross. Perhaps it wants to follow us to the island." "Nay, it's seeking to cross." As if to remove all doubt, they heard a querulous whine, a short series of lifting cries such as a dog makes when it finds itself barred by something that surpasses its understanding. "Aye, it's wishful to cross," the Scot repeated. "I think I'll take a row across by there," and as he spoke, he walked to the beach and lifted the bow of the rowboat. The The shipped oars thumped on the rowlocks, and the noise went eddying across the still surface of the loch. At that moment, Leslie Freeth saw the dog lift its head and then turn away. "It's going, Mr. McBain," he called. The Scot looked up. He straightened. The two men watched the collie turn into the underbrush. Only once in a while could they see a glimpse of the dog as it trotted steadily along the edge of the loch toward the west. It went confidently, as if now it had made up its mind. "It's on his way the noo," McBain said. "Poor thing, it's got a long road to gang." "You mean it's going to walk around this loch? Why, that'd be miles and miles." "It'll have to gang near 100 miles before it can get by." The artist stared at the older man, a little incredulously. "You mean to tell me the dog is going to walk 100 miles just to get round a lake? Why—" Freeth began to laugh, but McBain's tone halted him. "Mr. Freeth, a collie is by origin a Scottish dog, and it has in it the courage and pertinency of this land." McBain said it reprovingly, and Freeth recognized the tone behind the words. He moved on. "Mr. McBain." "Aye? What do you think it wants to cross for? Why would it?" The Scotsman stood still a long time. Then he said, "Now, who could say? Only one thing, forby. It's got business somewhere, and it's ganging about its business. It's asking help from their body on the space of the earth, and—" Here McBain turned his boat and clambered in. "And then," he continued, "it's an example which all the rest of us might weel do to follow." Freeth smiled to himself. The dour old man had a habit of turning all things in nature to a stern lesson on human conduct. His mind went back to his painting, and his eye only half saw the boat growing smaller and smaller as McBain pulled it across the water, leaving him in solitude. Instinct is like the flight of a bird, for its directions are in mighty straight lines. So Lassie, in her quest to get home, had worked almost in a bee-line toward the village of Greenall Bridge, far to the south, sometimes turning or bending her path where the obstacles of towns or impassable mountains lay before her. She always came back to the instinctive line, to the south. So she had come down through the highlands, day after day of endless weary travel. Her line had been straight, but she had no way of foreseeing the land before her. She could not know that the instinctive straight line toward home would bring her to an impasse against the great lochs of Scotland. One can look at a map and see what an obstacle these are, for they are great, long bodies of water running almost due east and west, that almost cut the country in two. And although they look like narrow fingers on the map, they are not truly narrow in actuality. Wide, expansive bodies of water they are, and their far reaches are not to be swum by an animal. For narrow as they may be, the farther shoreline is often lost, or at best a thin, low-lying stripe of faint blue. No, the lochs are a fearful barrier. Man can cross in his boats and ferries, but not an animal. Yet, at the shore of the great loch, Lassie did not surrender her purpose. Her instinct told her to go south, but if that way was barred, she would seek some other way. So she started on her long trip to circle the lake. Day after day she worked west, fighting her way along circling hamlets and villages, but always returning afterwards to the lake's edge and working west. Sometimes it would seem as if the barrier were circled and the way free. For a spell, Lassie would trot at her unfaltering pace in the desired southern direction. But it was always just a headland that jutted out, a headland that reached into the water, and always Lassie would work to the southernmost tip and wade into the water, and with her head turned to the south, would give a short, questioning whine. And then always she must turn north again, back along the shore, to press west once more in her search for a way around. Dozens of bays and headlands, and just as many disappointments. A week after Leslie Freeth and McBain had seen the dog, she was still working her way west, and still the great, long loch stretched as a barrier that a dog could not understand. Here's our next chapter. When a dog is ailing. Lassie trotted from a thicket and came to the shore. She was moving more slowly now, for the pads of her feet were bruised and sore, and in the delicate membrane between those pads on the right forefoot a thorn was festering. Nor was her head as high now, and there was less confidence in her way of going. Often, at times, it seemed as if she had forgotten why she was on her endless journey, but this was never for long, and now her pace became steady again, and she quickened it, carrying herself so that her afflicted paw took less weight. Her head turned hopefully, for on her left now, at last, was no great impassable body of water. The loch had narrowed to a river, but it was a tumultuous, fast-charging river that cascaded fiercely over the rocky bed. Lassie came to the water's edge. She turned her head to the west again, but there, not far below her, was a town. From a bridge there were boys, fishing, shouting, filling the air with their cries, and Lassie was still wary of human beings. She gazed steadily at them, and then she looked again at the white tumbling water. The roar of it drummed unpleasantly in her ears. Yet she hesitated only a moment. Then, boldly springing, she launched her body far out into the water. The current caught her as a piece of paper thrown from a moving train is snatched up by the wind. So the water bore Lassie's body downstream as she landed. The power of the river tumbled her about, but she came to the surface and began striking out for the far shore. Her head was outstretched. Her 4 feet drove steadily, pumping her along. Again and again the current tumbled her with crushing force, and often she was submerged in swift eddies, but each time the marvelous direction sense of a dog never deserted her, and as she came up she was still fighting in the right direction. A man battered on a football field might start to carry the ball in the wrong direction, but the direction sense of an animal is not so easily defeated. Always Lassie struck out toward the southern bank. But the stream had now carried her down toward the village. The boys on the bridge saw the spectacle of a dog being whirled by the current. They shouted and hallooed. With the cruelty of the young that sometimes gets free rein, they picked stones from the roadbed and flung them at her. As her body was whirled under the bridge, they ran across to the downstream side and continued their senseless pelting. Lassie still fought on, and now she was at last nearing the other bank. A cascade was below her. Her driving feet raced, but they were not powerful enough. The current caught her, and she felt herself being whirled through space. Her body was driven cruelly against a rock, and the stab of pain ran like fire along her side. The current drew her down, and she disappeared. The boys on the bridge, looking now far downstream, gave a shout, almost of insane triumph, such as the Tuscan army might have given before the moment of silence when Horatius leapt into the Tiber. Then they were still. They stood gazing at the tumbling water. At last, after it seemed that too much time had passed, they shouted again. There, in a backwater, Lassie's head broke the surface again, and she was still driving with her legs. Now the water was still, and she was able to master it. Fighting, swimming, driving with all her force, she made the landing. Her feet touched the ground. The water soaked into her coat seemed to be too much of a burden, for she staggered at that moment, and her weary muscles seemed unable to hold her. She started to drag herself clear, but now, for the first time, she became aware of another danger. The troop of boys was dashing down the riverbank, sounding a wild chorus. Lassie called on her last strength. She pulled herself up the bank. She did not even wait to shake the water from her coat. She did not halt for the old pain in her forefoot, nor the new one that seared like fire along her side. Her mind held only one thing. At last she was across. After weary days of thwarted direction sense, she was at last free to go south. The barrier was passed. She broke into a clumsy lope. The noise of the lads behind her faded. Now that the great barrier of the loch was circled at last, Lassie drove in her desired direction with clearer intensity. The village and the shouting boys were soon left behind. She dropped from the gallop to the slow trot that covered the most ground with the least effort. The pain in her side and her forepaw did not come into her mind. She adjusted her gait as best as she could to favor her injuries. Soon she left the road behind and set her path across meadows and flatlands. At sundown she was still traveling, as if, now that she could follow the line south again after so many days of going westward, she could not travel long enough to satisfy the urge within her. It was long past nightfall when at last she denned up where a clump of gorse arched over beside a field wall. She lay close to the ground. The coolness of the earth there, sheltered from all suns, felt good to the burning ache in her side. She licked at the forepaw, trying with her tongue to reach between the pads where the thorn festered. For nearly an hour she worked, but in the end the thorn still rested there. With a sigh that was almost like that of a tired man, she crossed her muzzle over her extended foreleg and closed her eyes. It was not yet dawn when she woke. She yawned and tried to raise herself. Her forequarters came from the ground, but her hindquarters did not move. She sat for a moment as if in surprise at this new and puzzling problem. Then again she strained, pulling with the muscles of her shoulders. For a second she managed to stand upright. She took one step forward and gave one hop with her good back leg, and the other one did not work. During the night, the injury to her side had stiffened. In the last crash against the rocks in the tumbling river, she had broken one rib and bruised badly the muscles and joints of her hind leg. They had now almost stiffened to immobility. Hobbling badly, Lassie turned around in the shelter under the gorse. Then she let herself fall heavily to the ground. She curled herself up and lay silently, her eyes staring through a mass of stalks and tendrils toward the field where the first hint of dawn was showing. She could travel no further. Instinct told her that. She must stay here. When human beings are ill, they often make a show of their injuries and parade them so that others may see and give them sympathy. It is just the reverse with an animal living in its natural state, asking no sympathy, deeming rather that weakness of any kind is something to be ashamed of. It crawls away into some hidden corner, and there alone it awaits the outcome, either recovery or death. This same force held Lassie to the den beneath the gorse. The desire to travel often racked her, but the animal law to stay hidden during injury overcame it. For days she lay, coiled and hidden away, her eyes bright but unmoving. Outside, the world went through its cycles. The darkness and the daylight followed each other. The birds sang. Once some field laborers passed. Sometimes the wind brought the unmistakable hot, near scent of a rabbit. Once a weasel, questing through the field, came part way through the gorse toward the den. His sharp eyes saw the coiled furry shape. His nose trembled. For a moment he stood, unmoving. Then he turned calmly and went on his way, as if knowing the sick animal had no desire to pursue him. All those things passed, but Lassie did not stir. The fever raged in her and possessed her body. For 6 days she lay, almost without a move. Then, on an afternoon, the sun was slanting lower, she lifted her head at last. Slowly, weakly, she began to lick her forepaw. Nature had done its work. From the festering sore, the thorn had worked its way. Little by little, Lassie licked it clear and then cleaned the wound. She looked about her. Slowly, she struggled to her feet. Her bad hind leg hung, not touching the ground. Slowly, she limped from her hiding place. Hobbling across the field, she went downhill to where her nose told her that there was water. She found the tiny streamlet, lowered her head, and lapped. It was the first time that she had drunk for a week. Wow. Here's a picture of her all curled up and trying to heal. Greedily, she took the water. She lay down by the stream, but her head now stayed erect. Her nose lifted, and she gave a sharp, protesting cry. She stood and faced to the south. Then she looked back to the gorse clump. At last she turned and hobbled again up the hill. Now some of the stiffness was gone from her body, and she managed to go quite freely on 3 legs. Returning to the gorse clump, she crawled into the shelter and lay there, patiently waiting for the night. For 2 more days she rested there, making brief trips to the stream to quench her thirst. But of food she had none, nor did she seem to desire any. 9 days after she had crossed the turbulent river, she came out from her den and made her way to the drinking place. Now she looked as if she were using all 4 feet, but the bad hind leg was still carrying no weight, only going stiffly through an imitation of its function. She lapped the clear water and, as before, raised her head afterwards and looked toward the south. In her mind something was stirring. It was the time sense. Faintly in the depth of her mind, the time sense that had been blotted out during her illness woke again. It was time. Time to go. Time to go for... Then Lassie knew once more. This was the time she should be keeping the rendezvous at the schoolhouse. But the school, it was there in that direction. That was the way to go. She turned her head once and looked up the field toward the gorse clump by the wall. But it was only for a moment. Then stiffly she crossed the stream. Going slowly, she struck out to the south. Lassie was on her way again. There was no proud show collie that trotted boldly now. It was a travel-stained dog, its body weak and pinched, racked from the long days of starvation and with the fever that had passed. It was a painful shuffle rather than a proud trot that carried the dog along. And it did not last long. Shortly after sundown, Lassie halted again, this time by a snug, walled-in place. It was a shooting point in which the wealthy men stood hidden as the birds were driven over them during a grouse season. But Lassie did not know this. All she knew was that it gave her protection and warmth. Nor did Lassie know that she had come but 3 miles from the den under the gorse clump. The greatness or the smallness of a distance do not qualify in the minds of an animal. All she knew was that she felt satisfied. She had made her way in the direction in which she wanted to go, more than she wanted anything in life. She breathed happily. She lifted her ears, and the tip of her nose moved. The scent of rabbit came to her clearly. Food! At last she was aware of it again and desired it. A ravening hunger woke in her, and the saliva formed in her mouth. She edged herself forward from the corner of the shooting point. Soon she would eat again, and soon she would travel again with recovered strength. She edged forward silently. If she was too weak and slow now to capture food for herself, she must die, for she would soon be weaker from starvation. If she was strong enough and quick enough now to capture food, soon she would be stronger. She crept forward, going like a ghost toward her quarry. Ooh, and that is the end of our chapter for today. Wait until tomorrow to see what happens as she is looking for food.